It began with a vibration, a subtle tremor against the polished surface of the bedside table, barely audible over the gentle hum of the air conditioner. I was half asleep, cocooned in the comforting weight of our down comforter, my mind adrift in that hazy space between dreams and consciousness. Mark was in the shower, the rhythmic pulse of the water, a familiar morning soundtrack. For 10 years, that sound had been my anchor, the steady beat of a life I believed was perfect. Our life was a carefully curated masterpiece. A sprawling Tudor-style house in the suburbs, 2 bright, beautiful children tucked away at a prestigious boarding school, and a marriage that was the envy of our friends. Mark was a successful investment banker, and I was the perfect corporate wife, elegant, supportive, and blissfully unaware. Or so I thought. The phone vibrated again, a persistent buzz that nudged me from my slumber. I reached out, my fingers fumbling for the cool metal of Mark's phone. It was a habit, an innocent gesture born of years of shared intimacy. I'd answer his calls if he was busy, reply to a text from his mother, or silence the alarm he'd inevitably forget to set. It was part of the seamless tapestry of our life together. But this time, something was different. The screen lit up, and a name flashed across it. Sarah. My Sarah. My best friend since college, the woman who had held my hand through labor, the godmother to my children. My heart gave a little flutter of warmth. She was probably just confirming our lunch plans for the weekend. I swiped to open the message, a smile already forming on my lips. And then the world tilted on its axis. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. The words were a punch to the gut, a sudden, violent expulsion of air from my lungs. I read them again, and then a third time, the letters blurring into an incoherent jumble. It had to be a mistake, a wrong number, a joke, anything but the truth. But the name on the screen was Sarah S., and the phone in my hand was Mark's. I felt a cold, creeping numbness spread through my veins, a chilling premonition of the abyss that had just opened up beneath my feet. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a rational explanation, a life raft to cling to in the churning sea of my disbelief. But there was none. The bathroom door opened, and Mark emerged, a cloud of steam billowing around him. He was handsome, impossibly so, with a towel slung low on his hips and water droplets glistening on his broad shoulders. He smiled at me, the same easy, confident smile that had first captured my heart all those years ago. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said, his voice a low, rummy baritone. I said nothing. I couldn't. The words were lodged in my throat, a thick, suffocating knot of betrayal. I just stared at him, my eyes tracing the familiar lines of his face, searching for a flicker of guilt, a shadow of deceit. But there was nothing. Just the same loving, adoring gaze he always gave me. He frowned, his smile faltering. "Jen, you okay?" I forced a smile, a brittle, fragile thing that felt like it would shatter into a million pieces. "Just tired," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse. He walked over to the bed and leaned down to kiss me. His lips were warm, familiar, and yet, in that moment, they felt like the touch of a stranger. The scent of his soap, a scent that had always brought me comfort, now filled me with a nauseating revulsion. As he turned to get dressed, I placed the phone back on the table, my movements slow, deliberate, as if I were handling a venomous snake. The screen went dark, but the words were seared into my memory, a permanent brand on my soul. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I went through the motions, a ghost in my own life. I made coffee, I read the paper, I listened to Mark talk about his upcoming business trip. But all the while, my mind was a whirlwind of questions, a chaotic symphony of pain and confusion. How long? How could I have been so blind? Sarah, my Sarah, the woman I had trusted with my deepest secrets, the one I had leaned on through every storm. The betrayal was a double-edged sword, each side sharper and more painful than the last. I thought back to all the signs I had missed, the little red flags that I had dismissed as nothing more than the harmless quirks of a long-term marriage. The late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls, the sudden, inexplicable distance that had grown between us, a subtle but palpable chasm that I had attributed to the stresses of work and life. I had been a fool, a blind, trusting fool. As Mark kissed me goodbye, his briefcase in hand, he gave me that same loving smile, the one that had once been my sun and stars. "I'll call you when I land," he said. I nodded, the brittle smile still plastered on my face. "Have a safe flight," I said, my voice a hollow echo of its former self. The moment the door closed behind him, the smile crumbled, and the first sob escaped my lips, a raw, guttural sound that seemed to tear through the silence of the house. I sank to the floor, the cold marble a stark contrast to the fire that was raging within me. The tears came then, a hot, torrential downpour of grief and rage. I cried for the life I had lost, for the man I thought I knew, for the friend who had driven a knife into my back. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut. And then, as the sun began to cast long shadows across the floor, the tears subsided, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The grief was still there, a gaping wound in my chest, but it was now tempered by something else, something darker, something more dangerous. Rage, a pure, unadulterated rage that burned away the pain and left in its place a chilling clarity. I would not be the victim in this story. I would not be the weeping, broken wife. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. They had taken my life and shattered it into a million pieces. But I would not let them see me bleed. I would pick up the shards, and I would use them to build something new, something stronger, something sharper. I rose from the floor, my movements no longer slow and deliberate, but filled with a newfound purpose. I walked over to the window and looked out at the manicured lawns and the perfect houses, a world that had once been my own. But it was a world built on lies, a fragile facade that had crumbled at the touch of a single text message. And as I stood there, the setting sun casting a blood-red glow on the horizon, I made a vow. They would not get away with it. They would not be happy. They would not have their perfect little love story. I would be the architect of their ruin. I would be the serpent in their garden. I would be the 1,000 cuts that would bleed them dry. And I would do it with a smile on my face. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in self-control. I moved through the empty house like a phantom, the silence amplifying the storm in my head. The initial shock, that raw, visceral agony, had receded, leaving behind a chilling, almost preternatural calm. It was the kind of calm that precedes a hurricane, a quiet gathering of forces before the world is torn apart. My grief was still there, a hard, cold stone in the pit of my stomach, but my mind was sharp, analytical, and hungry for information. I was no longer Jennifer, the loving wife. I was a detective, a spy in my own home, and the subjects of my investigation were the two people I had once trusted most in the world. My first move was to feign normalcy. When Mark called from his business trip in Chicago, his voice laced with the practiced affection of a seasoned liar, I played my part to perfection. I was the doting wife, asking about his flight, his hotel, the big meeting he supposedly had the next day. Every word was a carefully chosen lie, a sweet poison I dripped into the receiver. "I miss you already," he'd said, his voice a low murmur. "I miss you too," I'd replied, my voice smooth as silk, even as my knuckles were white from gripping the phone. "The bed feels so empty without you." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was a necessary evil. He couldn't suspect a thing. Not yet. The moment I hung up, the charade ended. I became a forensic investigator in my own marriage. The house, once a symbol of our shared life, was now a crime scene, and I was determined to uncover every piece of evidence. I started with his study, a room that had always been his sanctuary, a place where I was an infrequent visitor. The air was thick with the scent of old books and expensive cologne, a scent that now made my stomach churn. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. A receipt, a hidden phone, a photograph, anything that would give me a timeline, a map of their deceit. I ran my fingers along the spines of his leather-bound classics, pulled open drawers filled with meticulously organized files, and sifted through stacks of financial statements. It was a testament to his methodical nature, a trait I had once admired. Now, it seemed like a cruel joke. He could organize his life down to the last paperclip, but he couldn't manage to keep his promises. For hours, I found nothing. Just the mundane artifacts of a successful life. It was frustrating, a dead end that made me question my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Had I misinterpreted that text? The doubt was a fleeting, insidious whisper, a temptation to retreat into the comfortable ignorance of the past. But then I found it, tucked away in the back of his desk drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns, was a small, black, leather-bound journal. It was a brand I recognized, one he'd picked up on our trip to Italy 5 years ago. He'd claimed he wanted to start journaling to document our travels. He'd written in it for a week, then declared it pretentious and tossed it aside. Or so I thought. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The first few pages were filled with his familiar, looping script detailing our days in Florence and Rome. I saw a ghost of the man I married in those words, a man I once loved with a desperate, all-consuming passion. A wave of nausea washed over me. I flipped through the pages, my breath catching in my throat. The entries became sporadic, then stopped altogether. For a moment, I thought it was another dead end. But then, tucked into the back pocket of the journal, I found a single, folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from a jewelry store, dated 6 months ago. The item purchased was a delicate, diamond-encrusted necklace. A necklace I had never seen. The date on the receipt was seared into my brain. It was the day of our 10th anniversary. He had told me he had to work late, that he was closing a big deal. He had come home with a bouquet of roses and a flimsy apology. I had smiled and told him it was okay, that I understood. I had been the understanding wife, the supportive partner. While I was at home, waiting for him, he was buying a diamond necklace for my best friend. The cold, hard proof was a physical blow. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. This wasn't a fleeting mistake, a moment of weakness. This was a calculated, long-term affair, a parallel life he had been living behind my back. The next piece of the puzzle was Sarah. My beautiful, vivacious, treacherous Sarah. I needed to see her, to look her in the eye, and pretend that my world hadn't just been shattered by her betrayal. I called her, my voice, a carefully constructed mask of cheerful ignorance. Sarah, I was just thinking about you. How about that lunch we talked about? Her voice, when she answered, was a symphony of false sympathy. Oh, Jen, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. Things have been so crazy lately. How about tomorrow? Tomorrow's perfect, I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness that was utterly alien to the rage that was coursing through my veins. We met at our favorite spot, a chic little bistro with white tablecloths and overpriced salads. She was radiant as always, dressed in a stylish, form-fitting dress that I now realized was probably a gift from my husband. She hugged me, a warm, familiar embrace that now felt like a viper's coil. You look amazing, she said, her eyes sparkling with a light I now recognized as deceit. So do you, I replied, my smile a work of art. We talked about everything and nothing. The kids, the latest gossip, the upcoming charity gala. I was a master of deception, a puppeteer pulling the strings of our conversation, guiding it ever so subtly towards the topic of her love life. So, I said, taking a delicate sip of my wine. "Anyone special in your life? You've been so secretive lately." She blushed, a faint, rosy hue that spread across her cheeks. "Oh, she said, her voice a coy whisper. "Maybe." "Maybe," I pressed, my voice a playful tease. "Come on, you can tell me. I'm your best friend." The words felt like acid on my tongue. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, there is someone. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" I asked, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. "He's unavailable," she said, her eyes downcast. "But it's the real thing, Jen. I've never felt this way before." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table over and expose her for the lying, cheating snake that she was. But I didn't. I just sat there, my mask of sympathy firmly in place, and listened as she waxed lyrical about her secret lover, the man who made her feel alive, the man who was, in fact, my husband. She painted a picture of a whirlwind romance, of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. She spoke of his passion, his intelligence, his unwavering devotion. Every word was a fresh stab to my already bleeding heart. As she spoke, I studied her, my mind a cold, calculating machine. I noted the way her eyes lit up when she talked about him, the way she unconsciously twisted the diamond necklace that was nestled in the hollow of her throat. The same necklace from the receipt. It was all there, laid bare before me. The full, ugly, devastating scope of their betrayal. I left that lunch with a smile on my face and a storm in my soul. The shock was gone, replaced by a chilling, unshakable certainty. I had the evidence. I had the truth. And now I had a purpose. They had underestimated me. They had seen me as the quiet, unassuming wife, the loyal, trusting friend. They had no idea of the darkness that lay dormant within me, the fire that was waiting to be unleashed. They had started a war, and I was going to finish it. The days that followed were a strange, surreal dance of deception. I was a ghost in my own life, an actress playing the part of the loving wife, while the real Jennifer, the one who was screaming and clawing at the inside of my skin, was busy plotting a war. The grief was a constant, a dull ache in my chest that never quite went away, but it was now overshadowed by a new, all-consuming emotion, a cold, calculating rage that was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. I could have confronted them. I could have screamed and thrown things and demanded answers. I could have exposed their sordid little affair to the world and watched as their carefully constructed lives came crashing down around them. But that would have been too easy, too clean. It would have given them the satisfaction of a quick, dramatic ending, a fiery explosion that would have left them scorched, but ultimately free. No, I wanted something more, something slower, something more painful. I wanted to watch them squirm, to see the confusion and paranoia slowly eat away at them until there was nothing left but the bitter dregs of their own deceit. I didn't want to just end their affair. I wanted to obliterate it. I wanted to salt the earth so that nothing could ever grow there again. And so the plan was born, not in a flash of inspiration, but in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, as I lay in our cold, empty bed, my mind a whirlwind of vengeful fantasies. I would not be the wronged wife, the tragic victim. I would be the architect of their ruin, the unseen hand that would guide them to their own destruction. I would give them the death of 1,000 cuts. My first target was their finances. It was the foundation of their world, the bedrock upon which their comfortable, privileged lives were built. And I, as the perfect corporate wife, had a front row seat to the inner workings of Mark's financial empire. I had spent years smiling and nodding at his business dinners, absorbing the jargon and the gossip, filing away little nuggets of information without even realizing it. I knew his partners, his clients, his investments. I knew where the bodies were buried. Mark's firm was in the middle of a massive merger, a deal that he had been working on for over a year. It was his baby, the crowning achievement of his career. And I knew, from his late-night rants and his muttered complaints, that it was a house of cards, a fragile construction of inflated projections and risky investments that was one strong gust of wind away from collapsing. I began my assault with a whisper, an anonymous email sent from a secure, untraceable account to the lead regulator overseeing the merger. It was a masterpiece of subtlety, a carefully crafted web of half-truths and leading questions that hinted at financial irregularities, at hidden debts, and undisclosed liabilities. I didn't need to provide proof. I just needed to plant a seed of doubt. The email was a work of art, a symphony of corporate jargon and veiled accusations. I wrote about potential discrepancies in the due diligence process and unforeseen market volatilities that could impact the long-term viability of the merger. I was careful not to mention Mark by name, but I knew that the regulator, a notoriously cautious and by-the-book man, would have no choice but to investigate. The fallout was immediate. The merger was put on hold, pending a full investigation. Mark was blindsided. He came home in a fury, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He paced the living room like a caged animal, ranting about corporate espionage and jealous rivals. "Someone is trying to sabotage me," he seethed, his fists clenched at his sides. "Someone is trying to destroy me." I sat on the sofa, my hands folded demurely in my lap, and offered him a sympathetic ear. "Who would do such a thing?" I asked, my voice a soft, soothing balm on his wounded pride. He had no idea that the saboteur was sitting right in front of him, offering him a glass of his favorite single malt scotch. The investigation dragged on for weeks, a slow, agonizing bleed that drained the life out of the merger and sent Mark's career into a tailspin. His partners grew wary, his clients grew nervous, and the whispers of his impending downfall began to circulate through the rarefied air of the financial world. But I was just getting started. My next move was to target their personal finances. Mark had a secret trading account, a little slush fund that he used for his more discreet purchases. Like, for instance, a diamond necklace for his mistress. I had stumbled upon the account information months ago while organizing his files and had tucked it away in the back of my mind. A little piece of ammunition for a war I never knew I would have to fight. I didn't steal from him. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, I became a ghost in his machine, a phantom trader who made a series of small, seemingly insignificant trades that slowly but surely eroded the value of his portfolio. I bought high and sold low. I invested in failing companies. I made 100 tiny cuts that over time would bleed him dry. He was so consumed by the merger, so distracted by the chaos at work, that he didn't even notice. He was a man standing on a burning building, so focused on the flames that he didn't realize the foundation was crumbling beneath his feet. And then there was Sarah, my dear, sweet, backstabbing Sarah. She was a woman who lived and breathed social status, a creature of appearances and affectations. Her entire life was a carefully curated performance, and I was about to bring the curtain down. She was a freelance interior designer, a profession that relied heavily on word of mouth and a pristine reputation. I began my campaign against her with a series of anonymous online reviews, scathing critiques of her work that were just plausible enough to be believed. I wrote about her lack of vision, her exorbitant fees, her unprofessional behavior. I created a dozen different aliases, each with a unique voice and a believable backstory. The reviews were a slow poison, a subtle erosion of her credibility that sent her into a panic. She called me in a frenzy, her voice a high-pitched wail of indignation. "Someone is trying to ruin me," she cried, her voice thick with tears. "Someone is posting these horrible, untrue things about me online." I listened with a patient, sympathetic ear, offering her a shoulder to cry on. "It's probably just a jealous competitor," I said, my voice a soothing murmur. "Don't let them get to you." But I knew that she would. I knew that her entire sense of self was tied to her reputation, and that the thought of being seen as anything less than perfect would be a fate worse than death. The final touch was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. I knew that Sarah had a secret, a little skeleton in her closet that she had shared with me in a moment of drunken vulnerability years ago. She had a gambling problem, a penchant for high-stakes poker games that had left her with a mountain of debt. She had sworn me to secrecy, and I had kept her confidence. Until now, I sent an anonymous tip to a notorious gossip columnist, a man who took a particular delight in exposing the dirty little secrets of the rich and famous. The tip was short, sweet, and to the point. It detailed Sarah's gambling addiction, her mounting debts, and her desperate attempts to keep it all hidden. The column was published a week later, a salacious, sensationalized account of Sarah's secret life. It was a devastating blow, a public humiliation that shattered her carefully constructed image and sent her spiraling into a shame-filled abyss. And so, the first stage of my plan was complete. The seeds of their destruction had been sown. Their finances were in tatters, their careers were on the brink of collapse, and their reputations were in ruins. They were wounded, bleeding, and utterly clueless. They were so consumed by their own problems, so blinded by their own self-pity, that they didn't even have time to suspect each other. They were two drowning people, so focused on their own survival that they didn't realize they were pulling each other under. And I was the one who was holding their heads beneath the water. The financial ruin was a satisfying overture, a thunderous opening act that set the stage for the real drama to begin. But money, as I knew all too well, was just a means to an end. The real currency of our world was social capital, a delicate, intricate web of alliances and allegiances that could be unraveled with a single, well-placed tug. And I was about to become a master weaver. Our social circle was a gilded cage, a beautiful, glittering prison of expectations and appearances. We were the golden couple, the ones who hosted the most lavish parties, who donated the most to the right charities, who always had a smile and a kind word for everyone. We were the envy of our friends, the benchmark against which they measured their own success. And now, I was going to use that envy as a weapon. My campaign of social destruction began with a whisper, a subtle, insidious suggestion that all was not well in the house of Mark and Jennifer. I started with the women, the ones who gathered for book club and yoga and brunch, the ones who traded gossip like it was a precious commodity. I became a master of the backhanded compliment, the veiled insult, the carefully chosen word that could plant a seed of doubt without ever revealing my true intentions. "Oh, Mark is working so hard these days," I would say, my voice laced with a feigned concern. "He's just so stressed about this merger. I barely see him anymore." The implication was clear. He was absent, he was neglectful. He was a man who was putting his career before his family. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the facade of our perfect marriage, but it was enough. The women would exchange knowing glances, their minds already filling in the blanks. And then there was Sarah, my beautiful, treacherous Sarah. She had always been the queen bee of our little hive, the one who set the trends, who dictated the social calendar, who held court with a casual, effortless grace. But her throne was built on a foundation of lies, and I was about to kick it out from under her. I began to subtly exclude her, to create a world in which she was no longer the center of the universe. I would organize little get-togethers, intimate dinners, and weekend trips, and I would forget to invite her. When she would inevitably find out, I would feign a mortified apology. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. It was just a last-minute thing. I didn't think you'd be interested." The excuses were flimsy, transparent, but they were just plausible enough to be deniable. She couldn't accuse me of deliberately excluding her without sounding paranoid and needy. And so, she was forced to swallow her pride and pretend that it didn't bother her. but I knew that it did. I could see it in the flicker of hurt in her eyes, in the forced brightness of her smile. She was a woman who thrived on attention, who needed to be at the center of every storm. And now she was being relegated to the sidelines, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The masterstroke of my social campaign was the annual charity gala, the glittering jewel in the crown of our suburban social scene. It was the one night of the year when everyone who was anyone came out to play, to see and be seen, to preen and posture, and pretend that their lives were as perfect as their designer gowns. This year, I was on the organizing committee, a position I had deliberately sought out for this very purpose. I had a front row seat to the planning, the politics, the drama, and I was going to use it to my full advantage. My first move was to sabotage Sarah's contribution to the silent auction. She had donated a weekend at her family's beach house, a coveted prize that always sparked a bidding war. But I knew, from a casual conversation we'd had years ago, that the house was undergoing extensive renovations and would be uninhabitable for the next 6 months. I said nothing. I let her donate the prize. I let her bask in the glory of her own generosity. And then, on the night of the gala, as the bidding was reaching a fever pitch, I let the truth slip. I was standing with a group of the most influential women in our circle, the ones who held the social purse strings. I let out a little sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated concern. I just feel so terrible for Sarah, I said, my voice a hushed whisper. She's just so desperate to keep up appearances, what with the gambling debts and all. The women's eyes widened. Their ears perked up like meerkats, sensing a predator. Gambling debts, one of them asked, her voice a mixture of shock and delight. Oh, you didn't know, I said, my voice a symphony of feigned innocence. It's all over the gossip columns. And now, with the beach house being a complete construction zone, well, I just hope whoever wins the auction isn't too disappointed. The news spread through the ballroom like wildfire. The bidding on the beach house came to a screeching halt. Sarah, who had been preening by the auction table, was suddenly surrounded by a sea of cold shoulders and suspicious glances. She was a pariah, a social leper, and she had no idea why. But I wasn't done yet. My final act was reserved for Mark. He was scheduled to give a speech, a self-congratulatory ode to his own success and generosity. He had been practicing it for weeks, preening in front of the mirror like a peacock in mating season. As he took the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. He began his speech, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. But as he reached the crescendo, the part where he was supposed to thank his loving, supportive wife, the teleprompter suddenly went blank. He faltered, his words catching in his throat. He looked at me, a silent plea for help in his eyes. But I just smiled, a cold, serene smile that offered no comfort, no reassurance. He stumbled through the rest of his speech, a rambling, incoherent mess of half-formed sentences and awkward pauses. He was a man adrift, a captain without a compass, and the audience, who had once hung on his every word, now watched with a mixture of pity and contempt. He left the stage to a smattering of polite applause, his face a mask of humiliation. He came to find me, his eyes blazing with a furious, impotent rage. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "What was what, darling?" I asked, my voice as sweet as honey. "The teleprompter," he seethed. "It just went blank." "Oh dear," I said, my voice a picture of concern. "It must have been a technical glitch." He knew that it wasn't. He knew that I had done something, that I had somehow orchestrated his public humiliation. But he couldn't prove it. He couldn't accuse me without sounding like a madman. And so, he was forced to swallow his anger, to choke on the bitter pill of his own impotence. We left the gala early, a silent, seething couple in a car that felt like a tomb. The gilded cage had become a prison, and the bars were closing in. They were isolated, ostracized, and utterly alone. They had no one to turn to but each other, and that was exactly what I wanted, because now the real games could begin. The first 2 stages of my plan had been a resounding success. I had dismantled their finances and shattered their social standing, leaving them isolated and vulnerable, like 2 wounded animals circling each other in a cage. But the true masterpiece of my revenge was yet to come. I didn't just want to ruin them. I wanted to turn them against each other, to watch as their toxic little love affair curdled into a venomous cocktail of paranoia and distrust. I wanted them to become the architects of their own destruction. My weapon of choice was the serpent's whisper, the subtle, insidious suggestion that could poison a mind and corrode a soul. I became a master of psychological warfare, a puppeteer pulling the strings of their insecurities and fears. I started with Mark. He was a man who was defined by his success, his ego, a fragile, inflated balloon that was easily punctured. He was already on edge, his career in a tailspin, his reputation in tatters. He was a man looking for someone to blame, and I was about to give him a target. I began to plant seeds of doubt about Sarah, to paint her as a liability, a drain on his already dwindling resources. I would leave her credit card statements on his desk, casually highlighting her extravagant purchases. I would sigh and shake my head, my voice a mournful whisper. "I'm so worried about her, Mark," I would say, my voice laced with a feigned concern. "She's just so reckless with money, and with your finances in such a precarious position." I didn't need to finish the sentence. He was a man who was obsessed with control, and the thought of Sarah's profligacy dragging him further into the abyss was a nightmare he couldn't bear. But the true genius of my plan was the forged communications. I was a student of their digital lives, a silent observer of their texts and emails. I knew their rhythms, their patterns, their private jokes. And I was about to use that knowledge to create a symphony of deceit. I bought a burner phone, a cheap, untraceable device that would become my conduit of chaos. I started with a simple text message sent to Mark from a number he wouldn't recognize. I know what you're doing with Sarah, and I have proof. The message was short, sweet, and to the point. It was a shot in the dark, a calculated risk, but I knew that it would send him into a spiral of paranoia. He was a man with a guilty conscience, and the thought of being exposed was his greatest fear. He didn't reply, of course, but I knew that the seed had been planted. He would start to look at Sarah with a new, suspicious eye. He would start to wonder if she had been careless, if she had confided in the wrong person, if she was the source of his impending doom. And then I turned my attention to Sarah. She was a woman who was defined by her beauty, her vanity, a fragile, delicate flower that was easily bruised. She was already on the ropes, her social life in shambles, her reputation in tatters. She was a woman looking for a lifeline, and I was about to throw her an anchor. I began to subtly suggest that Mark was growing tired of her, that he was looking for a way out. I would casually mention that he had been talking to his lawyers, that he was worried about the financial implications of their affair. He's just so worried about his reputation, I would say, my voice a sympathetic murmur. He's afraid that this whole thing could ruin him. The implication was clear. She was a liability, a threat to his future, a woman who was about to be cast aside. But the real poison was in the emails. I created a fake email account, a plausible-sounding address that could have belonged to one of Mark's business associates. And then I sent an email to Sarah, an email that was designed to shatter her world. The email was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, a carefully crafted web of innuendo and veiled threats. It spoke of a potential PR nightmare, of a need to control the narrative, of a mutually beneficial separation agreement. It was cold, clinical, and utterly devastating. The email was a lie, of course, but it was a lie that was rooted in truth. Mark was a ruthless, pragmatic man, and the thought of him cutting her loose to save his own skin was not just plausible, it was probable. The fallout was immediate. Sarah was a wreck. She called me in a panic, her voice a hysterical sob. "He's going to leave me," she cried, her voice thick with tears. "He's going to throw me away like I'm nothing." I listened with a patient, sympathetic ear, offering her a shoulder to cry on. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," I said, my voice a soothing balm on her wounded pride. But I knew that it wasn't. I knew that the seeds of doubt had taken root, that the trust between them was beginning to fray. The final act of my psychological warfare was a piece of pure, unadulterated evil. I knew that Mark had a secret, a little skeleton in his closet that he had guarded for years. He had a child from a previous relationship, a son he had never acknowledged, a son he had paid to disappear. It was a secret that he had shared with me in a moment of drunken weakness, a secret that he had begged me to keep. And I had, until now. I sent an anonymous package to Sarah's apartment. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of a young boy with Mark's eyes and a shy, hesitant smile. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph. It was a grenade, a carefully timed explosion that was designed to obliterate whatever trust was left between them. Sarah would see the photograph, and she would see a man who was capable of a level of deceit that she had never imagined. She would see a man who had a secret family, a secret life, a secret that he had kept from her, and she would begin to wonder what other secrets he was hiding. The house of cards was beginning to tremble. The serpent's whisper had done its work. They were no longer lovers, but adversaries, two wounded animals trapped in a cage of my own making. They were so consumed by their own paranoia, so blinded by their own fear, that they didn't realize they were being played. They were turning on each other, just as I had planned. The accusations, the recriminations, the bitter, angry fights. I was a silent observer, a ghost in their machine, and I was savoring every moment of their self-inflicted agony. The end was near. I could feel it. The final cut was coming, and it was going to be a masterpiece. The air in our house had grown thick and heavy, charged with the unspoken accusations and simmering resentment that now defined our lives. The gilded cage had become a pressure cooker, and the tension was reaching a boiling point. Mark and Sarah were no longer the passionate, reckless lovers they had once been. They were two cornered animals, snarling and snapping at each other, their love affair dissolving into a toxic sludge of paranoia and fear. And I, the silent architect of their misery, was watching from the shadows, a grim smile playing on my lips. The financial pressures had become a crushing weight. The merger, once Mark's crowning achievement, was now a distant, impossible dream. The investigation had dragged on for months, a slow, agonizing bleed that had left his career on life support. His partners had abandoned him, his clients had fled, and the whispers of his impending bankruptcy were now a deafening roar. He was a man on the brink, his legendary confidence shattered into a million pieces. He spent his days locked in his study, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and empty bottles of scotch. He was a ghost in his own home, a shadow of the man he had once been. And Sarah, my dear, sweet Sarah, was not faring much better. Her interior design business had crumbled into dust, her reputation in tatters. The gossip columns had been merciless, feasting on the salacious details of her gambling addiction and her public humiliation. She was a social pariah, a woman who was shunned and ridiculed by the very people whose approval she had once craved. She had become a recluse, a prisoner in her own lavish apartment, her days a blur of tears and self-pity. She had tried to cling to Mark, to find solace in his arms, but he was a man drowning in his own despair, and he had no life raft to offer her. Their secret rendezvous, once filled with passion and excitement, were now fraught with tension and suspicion. They would meet in seedy motels and dimly lit bars, their conversations a litany of accusations and recriminations. "You're being careless," Mark would hiss, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "Someone is watching us. I can feel it." "I'm being careless," Sarah would retort, her voice a high-pitched shriek of indignation. "You're the one with the secret family. How could you not tell me about your son?" The photograph had been a masterstroke, a perfectly timed grenade that had blown their relationship to smithereens. The trust between them was gone, replaced by a gnawing, all-consuming suspicion. Every late-night phone call, every unexplained absence, every whispered conversation was now a source of paranoia. They were trapped in a feedback loop of their own making, their fear and distrust feeding on each other, growing stronger with each passing day. They were so consumed by their own private hell that they didn't even notice the bars of the cage closing in around them. The final act of my symphony of destruction was a piece of pure, unadulterated cruelty. I knew that Mark had one last hope, one final lifeline that he was clinging to with the desperation of a drowning man. He had a secret offshore account, a rainy day fund that he had been squirreling away for years. It was his escape plan, his get out of jail free card, and I was about to take it away from him. I had discovered the account information months ago, tucked away in a file labeled contingency. It was a testament to his arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, that he could always buy his way out of trouble. I didn't steal the money. That would have been too easy. Instead, I arranged for it to disappear. I used a series of untraceable wire transfers, a complex web of shell corporations and offshore banks, to move the money to a place where he would never find it. A place like, for instance, a charitable foundation for abandoned children. The irony was delicious. The day the money disappeared, Mark was a man possessed. He stormed through the house like a hurricane, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He tore his study apart, throwing books and papers to the floor, screaming obscenities into the empty air. He knew that he had been robbed, but he had no idea how. He was a man who had been outplayed at his own game, and the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. He had only one person to blame. The one person who knew about his secret life, his secret son, his secret shame. The one person who had the most to gain from his downfall. Sarah. He confronted her in a furious, desperate rage. He accused her of stealing from him, of betraying him, of being the architect of his ruin. He was a man on the edge, his sanity hanging by a thread, and he lashed out with the ferocity of a wounded animal. She, of course, denied everything. She was a victim, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She pleaded with him. She begged him to believe her, but he was beyond reason. He was a man consumed by his own paranoia, and he saw betrayal in every shadow, in every word, in every tear. The fight was epic, a screaming, shouting match that echoed through the thin walls of her apartment. It was the final, spectacular implosion of their toxic little love affair, a fiery explosion of rage and recrimination that left them both scorched and broken. He left her that night, a man defeated, a man who had lost everything. He was a king without a kingdom, a god without a single worshipper. He was nothing. And Sarah, my dear, sweet Sarah, was left alone in the ruins of her life, a woman who had been betrayed by the man she loved, a woman who had been abandoned by the friend she had trusted. She was a ghost, a shell of her former self, a woman with nothing left to lose. The house of cards had fallen, the game was over, and I had won. But I wasn't done yet. There was one final act to play, one final scene in my twisted little drama. I wanted to see them one last time, to look them in the eye and watch as the truth dawned on them. I wanted them to know that it was me. The final act was set. The stage was our home, the beautiful, sprawling Tudor that had once been the symbol of our perfect life. It was now a mausoleum, a cold, silent tomb that held the ghosts of a dead marriage. I had invited them both, Mark and Sarah, for one last meeting, a final public confrontation where all their secrets would be laid bare. I had told them that I wanted to talk, to discuss the terms of our divorce, to find a way to move forward. They had both agreed, reluctantly, their voices laced with a weary resignation. They were two broken people, two ships lost in a storm, and they were clinging to the hope of a peaceful resolution, a quiet end to their suffering. They had no idea that I was the storm. I had prepared for this moment with the meticulous care of a master craftsman. I had arranged the living room like a stage, the lighting dim, the air thick with an unspoken tension. I had placed a single, ornate chair in the center of the room, a throne for the queen of this shattered kingdom. I was dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, my hair pulled back in a severe, almost regal style. I was no longer the weeping, broken wife. I was a woman of power, a woman of purpose, a woman who had risen from the ashes of her own life to become the architect of their destruction. Mark arrived first. He was a shadow of his former self, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his gaunt frame, his eyes hollow and haunted. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and confusion, a man who was struggling to understand how his world had fallen apart. Sarah arrived a few minutes later. She was a ghost, her beautiful face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She looked at Mark with a venomous glare, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred that was a far cry from the adoring gaze she had once given him. They sat on opposite ends of the sofa, a chasm of silence and suspicion between them. They were two strangers, two enemies, two people who had once shared a bed and a secret, and who now shared nothing but a mutual loathing. I sat in my throne, a faint, enigmatic smile on my lips. I let the silence hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket that amplified the tension in the room. I watched them squirm. I watched them shift uncomfortably in their seats. I watched them avoid each other's gaze. And then I began to speak. My voice was calm, measured, almost conversational. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply told them a story. A story about a woman who had everything. A woman who had a perfect life, a perfect husband, a perfect friend. A woman who had lost it all in the blink of an eye. I told them about the text message, about the jewelry receipt, about the secret journal. I laid out the evidence of their betrayal, piece by piece, like a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury. They listened in stunned silence, their faces a mask of disbelief and horror. They had no idea that I had known, that I had been watching them, that I had been collecting the pieces of their deceit. And then I told them the second part of the story of what happened next, the story of the anonymous emails, the phantom trades, the online reviews, the gossip columns, the story of the burner phone, the forged communications, the secret son, the disappearing money. I told them everything. I laid my soul bare. I exposed the darkness that had taken root within me, the cold, calculating rage that had been my constant companion for the past year. As I spoke, I watched their faces. I saw the dawning horror in their eyes, the slow, sickening realization of the truth. They were not the victims of a cruel, random fate. They were the victims of a deliberate, meticulous, and utterly ruthless campaign of revenge. And I was the architect. When I was finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence that was filled with the weight of their guilt, their shame, their utter and complete devastation. Mark was the first to speak. His voice was a hoarse, broken whisper. "You," he said, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "It was you, all of it." I just smiled, a cold, serene smile that offered no comfort, no absolution. Sarah was next. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a strange, twisted kind of admiration. "You're a monster," she said, her voice a trembling whisper. "No," I replied, my voice as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. "I'm a mirror. I'm just showing you the monster that you created." And then I delivered the final cut, the one that would bleed them dry, the one that would leave them with nothing. "I have a file," I said, my voice a low, dangerous purr. "A file that contains all the evidence of your affair, of your financial crimes, of your lies and your deceit. A file that I have sent to the SEC, to the IRS, to every major news outlet in the country. A file that will be released to the public in exactly 1 hour." The color drained from their faces. They were ruined, utterly, completely, and irrevocably ruined. They had lost everything. Their money, their careers, their reputations, their friends. They had lost it all, and they had no one to blame but themselves. I rose from my throne, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the door, my head held high, my back straight. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their eyes on me, their gazes a mixture of hatred and fear, and a grudging, horrified respect. I stepped out into the cool night air, the darkness a welcome embrace. I took a deep breath, the first truly clean breath I had taken in a year. The weight of my grief, my rage, my vengeance, it was all gone. I was free. I walked away from the house, from the life I had lost, from the people who had wronged me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew that I was leaving the past behind. I was walking into a new life, a life that was my own, a life that was built not on lies, but on the hard, cold, and ultimately satisfying truth of my own strength. The serpent had shed its skin, and I was reborn.